swearing, Christine.
Hello and welcome to another episode of RevelCoach Plus. I am Alison, Nissen, and along with my sister Marcy Stoudt, we are RevelCoach and we are glad you're here. Today, we have the HR guru, Christine Johnson, here with us. Christine is a 30-year HR executive with a ton of experience. She's brought together teams to help women navigate and bring a sense of calm and no stress, relieving the stress, and let's create a way that we can help our companies move forward. But I'm going to start with a really basic question. I've heard recently that there's DE&I, and we all know that that's diversity, equity, inclusion. But recently, I've been introduced to the term of DEI B. Christine, what in the world is that? And just fill me in.
Sure. So diversity, equity, inclusion. The B is actually belonging. So creating not only that inclusive environment, but an environment where people feel like it's their team. They belong to an organization. They belong on the team. They connect with that leader and with the mission, vision, values of the organization. So that's really what the B stands for.
All right, so such a subtle difference between inclusion and belonging. Can you just elaborate a little bit more on that? Because I do feel like companies, as they are kind of returning back to work in 2022 in the office and everything, people really are wanting to belong to something, but I'm not sure I quite understand the difference between inclusion and belonging.
Well, they're very similar. So, including people in the conversation, I think is what we mean with inclusion. Belonging is where I really connect with the organization or the team or the work that we're doing. And so I'm included in things, my voice is, matters, but belonging is really feeling like I'm making an impact with the organization or with the team.
And so I'd love to ask this question from 2 points of view, actually, maybe even 3, but one is there's the HR policies that are helping companies do just that. And then the other part is the leaders. And the third part is the employees. Can we kind of ask this question 3 ways? From the leadership standpoint, what are some habits they need to change or habits they need to embrace to kind of create more of a belonging with their teams?
So I think the first thing is to really look inside and focus on the authentic portion of who you are, what you bring to the table, who you are as an individual, and creating a safe environment to have a conversation with your team and allow them to do the same thing. So when you do that, you create that trust, that mentorship, a safe space for people to talk about what's going well and maybe what's not going well. For the employee, certainly, you see the vulnerability of the leader and your teammates. And so that allows you that space to, really meld together as a team. And, the literature shows, I read an article today from the Harvard Business that basically talked about high performing teams and that vulnerability and connecting in that way. That sense of belonging really helps create those high performing teams. And then from an organization standpoint, really the same thing, right? It's a lot of leaders, typically with a lot of different teams. And how do you want people to show up to really meet those business needs? And move the organization forward. So we're all rowing in the same direction.
All right, so making this change is probably easier said than done. So let's just say you've got a company and their culture is decent and it's a good company. They've got a pretty clear mission statement, but they're not quite there with like belonging or accepting vulnerability and things like that. But you have a leader that is like on top of it and they, the president, CEO saying, this is what we're going to do go forward. We want to change this. What are some kind of like traps that happen? Like, so from the employee perspective, what do they do? What should they do? Maybe what should they hesitate? What are some of the challenges that teams are facing as they try to go down this path?
Sure. So, it's not a one and done, it's a journey. And I think recognizing that first and taking a look at the culture. So you just mentioned that the culture is decent. taking a step back and starting with the foundation, I think, is critical for the organization, the leader, and the team. You know, what is that? What are our strengths? And how do we want to communicate that? And most of the time, where the breakdown happens is in communication. We don't understand the why. Why are we doing this? What's in it for me? How does this help us as a business? And so you really have to take a step back and figure out all those communication channels and make sure that everyone understands the language, that we'll be using, the why we're doing it, and give them the tools that they need to be successful. And that's, more broad brush. And it's one step at a time. You're chipping away at the direction you want to move in. I think for a leader that's doing this very well and modeling that behavior, how do we replicate that? Adding each person's individual style to what they do. There's not necessarily one size fits all in terms of how we lead, but I think those foundations and fundamentals will really help them and help move forward.
You're mute.
I got it. When we talk about creating an opportunity for belonging, in many ways, it does start with that idea of authentic leadership. Mm-hmm. So we have leads, we have leaders, we have managers, and they're showing up and they're trying their best to be authentic, to be able to make those connections. What's a good first step in trying to create an environment that says, I know I'm a leader, but I'm here to create belonging?
Sure. So I think it starts with being self-aware. I mean, who are you? And why, thinking about why people want to follow me as a leader, really delving into what makes them want, they're not going to follow you blindly. So how do you create that connection with them so that they do want to follow you, they do want to get to know you, and you get to know them as well? That creates that trust, that connection that I think helps move you forward and gives them that sense of belonging. And it's challenging, I think. It's challenging, particularly in the remote and hybrid environment as well, because we have a whole new way that we're trying to communicate and connect with employees. And so it adds another layer. But it certainly, starts with that leader, creating that sense of connection.
It is interesting how much of the human connection we lost as we're on screen. So for instance, you often don't see, if you bring somebody on your team, you often don't see their hands. So you don't really know if they're married. And so then you're allowed to ask or not. And then the meeting starts almost, after a quick little chit chat, 5 people on Zoom, you just move into it. And people don't really, we really haven't had a lot of opportunities to connect unless you create those opportunities. So for the companies that want belonging, but they're still hybrid and they're still remote or things like that, any best practices for how they can kind of create more of a belonging culture?
Well, I think you have to be intentional, and much more so than you were when you were in person, and really creating a space in that meeting for people to connect. And so that might be asking a question. Think of it more like icebreaker, if you will, a chance for people to share what's going on outside of work with them. Not forcing people to do that, but really giving some time before you jump right into your, task at hand. I think also smaller groups as well allow you to do that. I mean, if you have 100 people on a Zoom, then you're probably not going to be able to do that. So doing breakout rooms or something of that. And then creating, when you can, opportunities for people to participate in work-related events outside of work as well. And so anything that builds team or camaraderie around that gives people the chance to get to know each other in a different way and know their leader. Their leader may feel intimidating to try and connect with that leader, but when you see them at Topgolf, maybe making a fool of themselves, if you're not a golfer like me, then you look at them in a different way. They are human, and they're not perfect. And I think sometimes too, leaders taking the opportunity to share not only successes, but also share times that they've had to pivot or maybe a failure as well, creating that vulnerability in that way that we're going to win together as a team. And we're going to pivot and we're going to shift and shimmy, but there's room and space for us to grow and learn together.
So one of the quotes I love from Brene Brown was when she talks about her own vulnerability hangover. So the woman that has inspired many people to create vulnerability as a mainstream conversation, she says, and she doesn't have it as much now, but she certainly has experienced it. And that first time you open up, you might not say what you really were thinking or anything like that. How are executives doing when they start trying to be vulnerable? Are they, I guess, like if it's new for them, are they finding the right things to talk about, or are the lines kind of blurry where they're just kind of being vulnerable in things that are subjects that are kind of deep in their thoughts and their heart?
I mean, I think it can be as simple as, maybe the meeting doesn't start off right. Maybe your technology is not working, and maybe there's humor that's added along with that, that's led by the leader, that, hey, not everything is perfect. I think the other piece of it is, it's very hard at times to be vulnerable. When are you vulnerable? What do you share? Or do you share too much? How is that going to impact the view of the individual? And so, really thinking about relevant examples that might help the team. So if you think back, if I've been a CEO for a long time, over my career, there may be something that I can pull from that happened that was similar or in a similar situation.
Yeah. One thing I was talking with a lot of my clients, it's pretty popular with my platform with women in leadership, and what's the right things to be vulnerable about, because often it gets confusing. It gets confusing for all genders, but I have a lot of women. But a lot of times, like if your day is really packed, so you got meetings back to back meetings, you want to be purposeful with being vulnerable, or as you're interacting with people, you're trying to build trust, and you accidentally, if you have an extra 20 minutes in your day, and that's it, they chit chat about things that could be more complaints. It could be anything. I mean, it could be it could be traffic. It could be, subjects that really aren't worth the airtime. So sometimes being purposeful with how you have those social interactions and choosing subjects that are like, you have mutual subjects that you're both important about, and then asking the question from that to guide the conversation away from being vulnerable about maybe subjects that is better for a good friend to hear or a spouse to hear or something like that, and then not really in the workplace. So my question to you, are you finding that from an HR perspective, the lines get a little blurry on when people are being instructed to be vulnerable, and then they share something that actually, the leader has to actually do something about because of, what they might be hearing or something like that?
Well, I think 2 points I would make. Certainly as the leader, when you're showing up, while you may be vulnerable, you're still showing up as the leader. And so guiding that conversation to something positive or something that encourages the team versus getting pulled down into the weather or traffic or something more negative, I think is you're leading that conversation, and that's your job to make sure that it's guided in that direction. I do think, there are some boundaries as well in terms of what we share and what we don't share. And if I think you set those ground rules up front, right? This is a safe space, but there are some ground rules around that. And here's the things that we're not going to perhaps share, or we're going to share those in a different way. I think that helps set the tone. And then if somebody, let's say maybe goes awry, then you nip that in the bud, if you will, and move on, right? And then you can have a conversation afterwards, for sure.
Christine, I'm gonna switch subjects just a little bit. Recently, I've heard the term fractional, CHRO. So I don't know if somebody's, I don't quite know what that means, how it works within a company. And then at the same time, how does it work with vulnerability if you're coming in from an outside, as an outsider?
Sure. So, if I were to describe fractional CHRO, that basically means that you're partnering with an organization to fill a specific need. So if you think about the consultant portion of it, you may be coming in to do basic HR, you may be coming in to build an HR team, restructure an HR team, so a specific purpose for them. But I think walking alongside of that organization is really critical in what you're doing with them. And so instead of handing, here's how you fix it, you're really partnering with them to make those changes. And what was the second part of your question?
As we were talking about vulnerability, and you have this person who's coming in with an outside perspective and a specific role to fill, how do you bridge that vulnerability gap as well as that outside perspective gap without it? I don't even know if it matters. I mean, maybe we all just need to show up knowing our universal truths and commonalities with the people that we're connected with.
Well, and that maybe depend on what you're focusing on. So you do want to get to know your audience and that connection with them, and being vulnerable may be simply saying, you know, in my experience, this is not the end of the world, or in my experience, we will be able to move past this, or in my experience, we have our work cut out for us, but we're here to do this together. I mean, that may be you know, I think it may depend on the circumstances and what you're brought in to do.
You know, and you just gave us great advice too. When somebody does start complaining, so what happens, like if you have a certain title, and I could imagine HR would be one of those titles often, where people come into you to kind of share something the company needs to know, but it gets turned around to like a complaint or a victim, or this is too hard or something like that. And the words you just use, which I love, which you're kind of saying, in my experience, you give them peace because you're like, we're going to get to the other side. And just keeping that in mind, that's a way of shaping the conversation. You can still keep listening to understand, why does this person have so many obstacles and so much like headwinds, but giving them confidence that as a leader, I'm listening because we need to figure out how to problem solve to move forward, and then always keeping that voice of moving forward. So I think that's really, I loved how you said that.
Absolutely.
So when it comes to onboarding new people, so everyone's hiring, we have the Great Resignation going on, which means a lot of people are hiring new people. What's it take to, you know, start from the very beginning? How do you kind of create this inclusion and belonging with new employees?
Well, I think you have to start with that foundation and that culture. You want them to experience your culture long before they ever walk through the doors or start with the organization. And so really taking a look at all those touch points with them to see, are you living and breathing your culture and your vision? I think the other piece is making sure that they have that warm welcome, you know, that they are acclimated to the organization and thinking through those barriers that they may have. We want to turn that Great Resignation into the Great Retention. And so what are all the things that we can do to help them feel that sense of belonging from the very beginning, from the time that they apply for the job all the way through the process?
And at the individual level, even if you're shy or an introvert, what are some great things and great practices you can do as a new employee to include yourself and to accept their invitation to belong?
Yeah. And so that may be a little overwhelming, I think, if you're an introvert, but I think if you have that structured onboarding process that allows those touch points, regardless of whether they're introverted or extroverted, it will help move them along. And then, you know, I think if you're the introvert, you want to accept those and you want to connect, particularly in the beginning, right? I do think most people go in with a lot of energy and a lot of enthusiasm, and they want to make that connection, and then they may take it back a little bit, right? And so up front is probably where we want to front load all of those things to engage them right from the beginning.
So does this, I imagine it looks a little different virtually. So if you're going into a virtual position versus an in-person or hybrid position, where coffee is an online coffee, is it something that is like the people they're paired up with somebody, they're paired up with a mentor or a partner to help guide them through the beginning stages of onboarding?
Well, I think companies have been really creative. And so let's say if we just take swag, for example, that you may receive when you're in orientation. You used to come in and you picked it up and you got a hat and a mug, and they're delivering those to the person and saying, don't open this. We're going to open this on our call. And so we're taking out that, and it may have the coffee in it, or whatever it is we're doing to onboard. And so, I think you can still create those connections. You just have to be intentional about it, right? Same with, if we're having a virtual celebration, we met a milestone. I've seen companies send cupcakes to every single person's home, right? From the local baker. And then they say, don't open this until we have our call. And then they announce the celebration, and everybody eats their cupcake at the same time. The other piece of that is I've seen them be very intentional about people that have food allergies, or maybe they can't have a cupcake, or maybe they're dieting. And so making sure that they're paying attention to that individual so that you create that sense of belonging, even in that environment, especially teams where a lot of people may be in the office that day, but there are people that live in Colorado or in a different place than where the company is. They need to have the same experience that the people in the room have. And that requires intentionality.
Yeah, I think the blended room is the hardest room.
Sure.
Easiest. Everybody virtual is what it is, but the blended room is really difficult, because I think the people, when they take a break for, say, a 15-minute water break, everyone else is carrying on the conversation down the hallway, and they're just missing out on the, kind of what the team is feeling to the response. So I'm a big fan of, if you are the virtual person, making sure you find ways of staying connected, like texting people beforehand, asking for a part of the agenda, or, asking questions or follow-up meetings. But really that we got to put that ownership on ourselves if we're not at the home office.
Not in the home office, right? Absolutely.
The mothership. With
That's
you,
great.
going from, so we have a lot of our members, people that watch these episodes, a lot of them are entrepreneurs. So you had a very successful corporate career, and now you are going into the consulting, the fractional CHRO role. Tell us, how did you, anything you've learned from kind of taking that jump into that space?
I think when you work for a corporate organization, there is that connection that you have with people, and they know what you're able to, your work product, if you will. And so when you are moving into this space, you not only have to present what you're doing, but also show right up front the ROI, or what value you're going to add to the organization or to that team. And so I think lessons learned is making sure that you have that as a part of your conversation up front, because you really get that one chance to have a conversation with individuals and pitch how you're going to be able to help them solve their problems. And that's really why they're reaching out to you, right? So how you're going to solve those issues. And so that's what I would say. I think the other thing is just leaning on your network. There are a lot of people you've worked with, or in my case, a very long time, reaching out and letting them know that you're there to help them with those business needs.
Mm-hmm. Well, your network's great because they already know your reputation, capabilities, and it seems to me right now the people part of the strategy is one of the top, if not number one, at least it's one or two for companies out there. So there's so much more work that needs to be done than people to actually do it. So I could imagine. So are you noticing any changes in people strategy? Like as people are trying to figure out how they retain people and how they think about hiring and things like that, has any major shifts or new trends that are coming our way?
I mean, I think looking at it from a different lens and, considering partnerships that you haven't had in the past, because maybe you had an abundance before, or you didn't have turnover before and now you do. And so really making sure you're having a conversation with those people that are working there to understand what it's like, removing those barriers, looking at compensation, looking at your onboarding. And then in terms of the recruitment piece of it, you're selling what it's like to work there. And so are you doing a good job at that? I mean, that's one of the critical things I think you have to look at. I'm also seeing, as technology continues to advance, you're losing some of that opportunity to really connect with people through that hiring process. And so really focusing on ways that you can connect with people in a different way. And that may be something like this, right? It may be virtual versus on site, but really allowing people to have that connection with you, I think will make the difference moving forward in terms of recruitment.
Well, I do feel like it's a great trend. Having the flexibility of people to be able to work in different places is pretty amazing. So you can get great talent, maybe not in the, where corporate office is based. And then just the overreaction of loss of connection has allowed many leaders to kind of think, how do we create more belonging, more connection with our people and being purposeful about it. So I do agree with you that it's a trend that's building, and I think it's a great trend. So Christine, if anybody wants to get in touch with you, what's their best approach to find more information about you, or maybe connect with you?
So I can certainly share my website, if you will, or my email, if that's helpful. That would be the best way to reach out to me to connect.
Wonderful.
What's the title of your website?
It's ChristineGrayJohnson.com.
Fantastic. Well, Christine, thank you so much for stopping by. I have learned a lot in this conversation. I think the discussion about, switching from what we hear of the Great Resignation to the Great Retention, and being able to bring authenticity, vulnerability, and belonging to the workplace is so valuable. Thank you so much for stopping by.
Well, thank you for having me today. It was great to chat with you all.
Thank you, Christine.
From Alison, Marcy, RevelCoach, feel free to watch always by subscribing to YouTube. Bye, guys.
Bye. Thanks so much.